Okay, well, we're recording. Got it. My name is Sarathy. I'm a board member of the DC branch of the IDA and a member of Decoding Dyslexia DC. And more importantly than that, I'm a parent of a second grader and a fourth grader with two very different reading profiles. And I know when my older son started kindergarten, I had no idea how children learn to read. I had no recollection of how I learned to read other than I was a bookworm. And I went to my older son's first kindergarten fall parent teacher conference. And I had no idea what to ask because I didn't know what I didn't know. And I suspect those of you here tonight are in a similar or a related boat as me. And so I'm so thrilled that we're having Amanda and Annie join us tonight because they're real local experts in early literacy. And I think will arm you with a lot of great information going into your parent-teacher conference and beyond. So Annie Murphy Karabell is a researcher with the Institute for Innovation in Education and an instructor in the School of Education at AU. She's taught graduate courses focusing on reading diagnosis and remediation, as well as reading science for schools and systems leaders. She's part of a partnership between AU and DCPS that supports early reading instruction and reading leadership in elementary schools. She's a mentor teacher to the DC Reading Clinic. She's worked as a reading specialist in private practice and taught special ed. She is the parent of a DC PS kindergartner, and she was also my professor in a reading diagnosis and remediation class. Amanda Granoff is a speech pathologist with Metropolitan Speech Pathology here in DC. She specializes in literacy and speech sound disorders. Amanda has worked in both public and private school settings, and during her tenure at the Lab School of Washington, Amanda provided speech, language, and literacy services to young students and served as the reading coordinator for the school's summer program. She received her master's from speech pathology at Vanderbilt and was lucky enough to complete a specialty track in a school setting, and that really sparked her love for reading and writing intervention. And Amanda is a strong believer in the impact of early intervention and loves working with families and educating, counseling them, and how to best advocate for their children with language and learning differences. So with that said, Amanda, can I ask what literacy skills should K-2 students by grade be working on at the beginning of the academic year?
This is a really good question, and for many people, it's a tricky one to answer. I would say in kindergarten, what you want to see at the beginning of the year is a lot of phonological awareness work. At the beginning of kindergarten, I'd want to see that my child has solidified and is strengthening skills like rhyming and syllable segmentation. So can they break a word like cupcake into its two parts? And then from there, moving to more advanced phonological awareness skills that we call phonemic awareness skills. So starting to get into taking words apart into their component sounds. So for example, breaking cat into k-at, blending sounds together. If you hear k-at, can your child blend it to make cat? So basically, I'd want to make sure those broader phonological awareness skills are solidified, and then dive deeper into the phonemic awareness. And then also in kindergarten, you're going to start to work on letter names and letter sounds, particularly with a focus on consonant and vowel singletons, meaning a B by itself, an A by itself, at the beginning of kindergarten. And then in first grade, I would say I'd really want the emphasis to still be building up phonemic awareness skills. There should be a huge emphasis on phonemic awareness. And for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with this term, it's basically, it's the awareness of the sounds in our language. And that these sounds, when put together, make up words. And those skills are the foundation for strong reading and spelling. So we want to make sure the foundation is strong in these early years, these K-2 years. And so I'd want to see that worked on still in the beginning of first grade. I think a lot more of an emphasis on getting into making words, whether that's, I would say starting with simple words that follow a consonant vowel consonant pattern. So again, like cat, dog, tub at the beginning of first grade, but quickly moving into other patterns as well. So some of you might be familiar with terms like silent E, for example. So like in the word bake, the E on the end makes the A say its name. That kind of pattern you would see focus on the beginning of first grade. And also words with what's called consonant blends. So the word best, for example, has the st blend at the end. Those types of words will also be worked on in first grade. And then at the beginning of second grade, children tend to move into more advanced code. So they might focus more on vowel teams, for example. So 2 vowels together making one sound. So the OA in boat, or the OW in snow, and more multi-syllable word work in second grade. So moving from code and single syllable words to more complex multi-syllable words.
Great, thank you. And Annie, how do schools, and maybe DCPS for as an example, how do they assess students' beginning of the year reading skills?
Absolutely. So a lot of the beginning screening will align with what Amanda said in terms of the skills that we're looking for. And so just to be clear, in terms of screening, what we're looking at is kind of a preview or a quick probe into some skills like phonemic awareness, letter naming, letter sounds. You may start to see some nonsense words in first and second grade as well. But just a kind of a quick check to see if there's a need for either more assessment or a more in-depth evaluation. So just to be clear, looking at screening. And then a lot of schools like DCPS will use something called DIBBLES. You may have heard that big acronym before. It just stands for Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. It really gives you a good glimpse into a student's performance on a given day. And so a lot of times the reports that will go to families will kind of, for each skill, we'll say if a student is in a green, a yellow, or a red range. And that gives you a good sense of how much support a student is going to need in order to progress to grade level. You may also see things like text reading comprehension, or you might see a level that corresponds to a letter of the alphabet. And my recommendation is to look more at the DIBBLES measures because those are nationally validated and normed, whereas there's a lot of variability in terms of the various alphabetic levels. So again, focusing more on the DIBBLES measures and those sub-skills like phonemic awareness, letter naming, letter sounds, and nonsense words.
And Annie, are those screeners, the results of those typically made available to parents?
Great question. So I think a lot of this depends on the school. At the school where I am, those results are often shared during the first conference of the year. If it comes up, and this is a strange year as we know, and a number of schools are doing kind of acceleration programs. So if something is flagged right away, often the classroom teacher or the reading specialist or ELA coach will reach out to the family to let them know that their student might qualify for additional support. And again, that's a kind of a thing that's unusual for this year. What the family will receive is more of a snapshot report. So kind of like what the score was for each skill, or maybe even just kind of what they call the composite, kind of the overall picture. But it's always a fair question to ask for more information. I often encourage families to ask whoever it is, the teacher or the reading specialist, to take a screenshot of the student's actual performance, because that can be really helpful for understanding what's going on at home, or if you want to get a second opinion, to have that to share with someone.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so let's say a parent has this DIBBLES snapshot or the composite, and they bring this to their parent their fall parent-teacher conference, how do they determine if what their child is receiving, the instruction and curriculum their child is receiving, is targeting the skills that they need to meet grade level benchmarks?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Right. How do we know? There are a lot of questions you can ask. And I would, but preface that by saying, if you have access to any kind of screening results ahead of time, to think about what questions you have and really put them in writing for the teacher ahead of time, so that they have time to think about it. They'll probably be able to give you a better answer if you have time to think about it. I know I certainly would in my high school teaching days. Definitely appreciate some time to think about it. And so questions you can ask are, what does the phonemic awareness instruction look like? What is the frequency of that? You can ask about what the phonics program is. You can ask, how is it differentiated to meet different kids' needs based on where they are? That's even more of a fair question now than in kind of typical times, because we know that students have had such uneven experiences over the past year. You can also ask what decodable books are available. So in other words, what kind of books would match the phonics instruction in the classroom? I think those are the big things that I would ask. Yeah.
And one more sort of related question. Let's say at a conference, a teacher or a reading specialist brings up a concern about a student's beginning of the year reading performance. And how does a parent make sense of what the intervention is that is being recommended and if that's going to meet their child's needs?
It's another big question. And so what we want to look at is, how well did the child do on these various screening measures? And does the intervention that's proposed correspond to that? So if you see, a student shows up as having difficulty with phonemic awareness, we definitely want the intervention to include phonemic awareness. Same thing. So if with phonics, if it shows up that they're having trouble reading real words or nonsense words, we would want to ask, well, what phonics patterns are included in the intervention, and do we have adequate practice with those? And
Amanda, how often would you recommend that parents ask for, any kind of like feedback or insight into how their children's intervention is going?
So I would first and foremost make sure everyone was on the same page before setting up a frequency for check-in. Everyone was on the same page with how goals are going to be measured, because I think that determines how often to check in. So, for example, if you have a reading fluency goal that is measured by increasing how words correct per minute, I wouldn't check in on that every month or every couple, I'd extend to every few months, because you're not going to see measurable gains in just 1 month. But I think it's reasonable to check in with the team for things like phonemic awareness, blending, segmenting, manipulation skills, development of an acquisition of different phonics patterns. I would expect that to come along if it's being targeted at a high enough frequency throughout the week. I would expect that a monthly check-in would show gains on those goals.
And what happens if a parent doesn't raise concerns about a child's reading progress? What if the school doesn't raise concerns, but parents have concerns? How do they go about raising that to the school? And, I feel like a lot of parents even are like, what language do I use?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. What do you do when you have concerns and the school might be not raising those concerns or saying your child's on grade level? That's really tricky. I would say to go into a meeting with proof and start collecting your own information and your own data to present to the school. So if you're reading with your child at home and you're listening to them make consistent errors on the page, I would actually jot down notes on what those errors look like. Is your child guessing at every word? Are they missing the same words they've been exposed to over and over again? Are they leaving out chunks of words? Are they leaving out sounds in words? If you kind of journal these things down, you have some nice evidence, if you will, to bring to a school and say, this is what's happening at home. I also suggest that you keep a log of how long homework is taking and how much support you're giving your child every night with homework. It shouldn't be this exhausting, frustrating, overwhelming task every single night. And if it is, that's a red flag. And that's, something else, I think, some hard proof you can bring to the school. And then I think another great piece of evidence, if you will, you can bring to the school is a writing sample from homework, because in a writing sample, you have so much information. You don't just get handwriting on the page, but you get information about spelling, which gives insight into what's happening with the sound system in the brain, the phonological system. You get grammar, you get vocabulary, you get organization, executive functioning, and you can kind of bring the sample to the school and say, take a look at this. These are my concerns. And then you have some hard evidence to move forward with.
Mm-hmm. And when might a family come to you? I mean, I imagine it may be at different points, but if a parent has concerns and comes to you, what kind of services as a SLP in private practice would you provide?
So I have the luxury of doing whatever I see fit and appropriate for the child. So not all speech language pathologists specialize in literacy, but there's a subgroup of us that do. And we do so because we are the language experts, and the sound system of our language, oral language, is the building block of written language, reading and writing. And so if a child were to come to me in private practice, I could really individualize a therapy plan for them based on any testing that they've come to me with or that I've completed. And I could cater that to what science tells us good reading instruction looks like, but specifically for this child. So I would spend part of my session on phonemic awareness work, phonics work, and then experiences with authentic text. And together, what we know about the reading brain is these things and spelling. And working on these things should help the child progress with their literacy skills.
How does a parent sort of marry, if they're working with you or someone like you, that outside reading support or enrichment their child may be getting with what they're doing at school, and managing that all the sort of players are on the same page and moving the same direction?
Yeah, another complicated question, and it's something I think a lot of parents are navigating. And as professionals, we, in my experience, I'm always trying to navigate, how do I come off as a collaborative team player so that the school wants to communicate with me and work with me. I think what parents can do is coordinate kind of like these touch point meetings throughout the academic year, where the whole team can have a brief moment together. Maybe that's every quarter or every semester, however your school does things, but to kind of align on goals for the child. I think when the parent can connect the clinician with the school administration or the teacher in a way that isn't that doesn't put the school in the defensive, but rather has feels collaborative, that's really effective. And I think if within those meetings, the private clinician, who probably oftentimes has a better chance to get to know the child because they're one-on-one, can share strategies and interventions and different selected text or programmatic approaches they integrate into their therapy with the school, it can be empowering for the school to then think, oh, okay, maybe, you know, Amanda said this resource is inexpensive and easy to use, and it's working really well for Jack. I'm gonna, you know, give this a go. So yeah, that would be my recommendation for kind of bringing the team together.
Annie, sort of a related question. If a child is receiving reading support at school, you know, how, I think I sort of touched on this earlier, but how does a parent know if the school has set goals that they're aggressive enough and reasonable? Like how, if you don't have a background in reading, how do you know if these goals make sense for your child and then see how close they are to meeting those goals? And,
That's
and
a great
who,
question.
and sorry, and who at the school, like, in addition to maybe the classroom teacher, you know, might a parent talk to about this?
So I think to answer the first part of your question, to kind of know if what's being targeted is appropriate for your child, I would first start off with just understanding, and I've kind of, I guess, spoken to this, but I want to make it really clear, kind of what good reading instruction looks like for all kids. So we want to see phonemic awareness work to an advanced level. We want to see phonics, and we want to see these enriching opportunities with text. So I would start there when speaking to the school about kind of, you know, how do I know my child is going to be progressing with these different goal areas? First, you want to see goals related to those areas. And then I would want to ask the school how they're measuring those goals. So are they going to provide you information on what phonics patterns were mastered in the last couple of months and what they're moving on towards? I think you can ask teachers to be specific in those instances, and kind of, you know, I think, you know, even with phonemic awareness, you can ask, is my child working on, you know, 2 sound words, 3 sound words, 4 sound words? So I think you can ask maybe every month or 2, just for a quick update on specifics, because that'll help you support your child at home as well. And can you remind me of the second part of your question? Who at the school should you reach out to?
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, like, you know, Annie, you may have thoughts on this, like for DCPS, and I know it varies by independent and public school system, but you know, if a student is receiving reading intervention but doesn't have an IEP, will they even have written goals, and is it reasonable for a parent to ask for them?
So not necessarily. I think it's really going to depend on the school and on the child and on the environment in which the child's receiving support. So if it's in kind of an acceleration academy, like kind of an after school piece that some of the DCPS schools are doing right now, you may see that there are goals. If it's additional support within the classroom, you may not see goals in particular. In terms of kind of thinking about what you should ask though, I would ask for what the goal is for the end of the year, so that you know what to keep in mind. What is the end goal? Where do we need to be at the end of kindergarten, first and second, and really what's the plan to get there?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you kind of think about kind of backwards planning, okay, if we need to get up to this many words per minute by June, then we need to be progressing at this rate. And that's the other thing that I would make sure to ask, is, you know, you might get a screening report that has, you know, it has red and yellow, and I would say don't be alarmed by one moment in time. We want to also look at the rate that a child is growing too. And so I think, you know, to respond, I saw a question in the chat, if I can kind of bring that in. You know, the how quickly a child is responding to in-person instruction is going to be a great measure of what's going on. We know for most kids, instruction over the past year was really difficult. Even under the absolute best circumstances was really difficult. But if we can see if a child is growing quite quickly, we know that they're moving, even if where they started might not be where they would have typically started for that grade.
And let's say the reverse, the converse is happening, that the child is not making as much progress as a parent imagines that they should be to meeting an end of school year goal. What are their options?
So at that point, I would, continue the conversation with the classroom teacher. You can ask for more evaluation at the school level. And if you ask, you are entitled to a response to that. And if you're not getting a response, then I think, reach out to IDA, Decoding Dyslexia, for some additional support on how to do that. But in a lot of cases, you may seek kind of a private evaluation as well. But I do think, to Amanda's point earlier, to continue to have that positive relationship with the classroom teacher and the school, the reading specialist, the ELA coach, sometimes it's an assistant principal for English language arts. So really depending on the person, but keeping them in the loop as to what's going on and what your hopes are.
And Annie, I know you're a mentor teacher at the reading clinic in DC. So can you, for those parents who aren't familiar with the reading clinic, can you talk a little bit about what it does, who it serves, and how parents can access it?
Absolutely. So the reading clinic kind of has a twofold purpose. So every semester, there are about, I think, 15, 20, 30 teachers who work with children one-on-one. And so it is professional development for the teachers to learn about the science of reading and structured literacy in a one-on-one environment. And then the children who work with them also receive one-on-one support twice a week for about 10 weeks or so. So to be involved in the clinic, the child's classroom teacher has to refer them to the clinic, and then from there the clinic will reach out and start the process. It is only available for children in the DC public schools at this time.
And who are other people that might serve outside of school? Let's say you can't access the DC Reading Clinic, or you're an independent school, in addition to an SLP, like who else might serve a child, a K-2 student who needs some reading support?
So a bunch of tutors. There are a ton of tutors in this area. I think, IDA, we probably have a list. I know the lab school has a list. Probably, Amanda can probably also provide a list. But I think reaching out to the people on this call, I think there's a kind of a very wide but very informal network of people. People who have gone through Orton Gillingham training, people who are certified through the Center for Effective Reading Instruction. You can look on their website for people who have gone through that process. I've done that myself, and so you can choose to be listed and know that someone has kind of passed a test with a certain level of knowledge. I think those are my main ideas for that.
Amanda, do you have anything to add to that? Because I feel like, as a parent, trying to find somebody to support your child in reading outside of school, if you decide and are able to go that route, can feel daunting. Like, how do I find somebody that's good? How do I know that they know what they should know? How do I know that they'll be able to communicate effectively with my children's school?
Yeah, so I'm biased, obviously, but I think many parents don't know that they can reach out to speech language pathologists for early intervention in literacy skills. So again, because phonemic awareness is a sound-based task ability, it's really appropriate for speech language pathologists, these language experts, to work with your child and build up those foundational skills that they need to launch as readers. So I would say definitely look into whether or not a speech language pathologist. Now, the speech language pathologists that work in DCPS don't typically work on reading. So this would be if you were going to a private practice, an outside speech path. At the Lab School of Washington, all of the speech language pathologists are skilled in working on literacy skills. And then in our practice, Metropolitan Speech Pathology Group, we're local in DC and also specialized in literacy skills. And I think there's a growing number of SLPs that are also specializing in literacy. So I would encourage you to reach out to a speech language pathologist specifically if you can't find a tutor.
And, you know, how can parents support their children's reading development at home if they don't have this background? You know, both the reading words on the page and decoding text, as well as building their own oral language skills. And I don't know if we've touched on this. Why are both important for early readers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think oftentimes when people refer to reading, they're actually referring to reading comprehension. They're not aware of the two big pieces that go into reading. So the end goal of reading is comprehension. But in order to get there, you need good word level skills. And I'll just briefly go through this because I don't think we did touch on it. So those word level skills would include using your phonemic awareness skills and your code knowledge, which means understanding the sounds that map to different letters or letter teams. So, you know, what I was saying a bit earlier, so OA spells O, or OU can spell ow and oo, understanding that code. So using those skills to build your ability to decode unfamiliar words, to read the words actually on the page, and then to also, I won't get into this term too much, but to orthographically map words so that they become effortlessly retrieved from your brain. That's one piece of reading. And then the other piece is the oral language skills that go into it: vocabulary, use of figurative language, sentence structure. So those are kind of like the two big pieces that go into being a reader. So at home, you can support both. And I would say my best advice is to read as much as you can with your child, and have your child read aloud with you so that in real time, you can provide them feedback on their errors. So that would be, you know, you could give specific feedback. So if your child says cart for cat, you could point out to them that they added a sound. Or if they say spit for split, you can point out that they left out the l sound. So pointing out those sound-based errors when you're reading aloud together is immensely helpful to your child. Things you don't want to do are encouraging your child to guess based on a picture, encouraging them to guess based on the first sound. Those are kind of bad habit formers you want to avoid giving as feedback to your child at home. But read, and reading aloud with that error feedback, I would say is the best thing you can do. And then reach out to your child's teachers or specialist, speech language pathologist, for text recommendations, because we want to make sure we're choosing the appropriate level of text for your child. I like to go, when I'm recommending, when a family says to me, you know, we have this book, my child's really interested in reading it, use the 5-finger rule. So go to a page in the book before you guys start reading it together, pick a page, have your child read aloud. If they make more than 5 big errors, so not switching out, you know, small words, like not substituting a for the, but if you see 5 big words on the page that they're struggling through, that book is probably too high of a reading level for them. So that could help you kind of choose what text you would read aloud together.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one last question. I see we have a lot of questions in the chat. And so I think a colleague of mine, Kathy, is going to group and share those questions. But the last question I wanted to ask you both is, this is in response to having several friends say to me, you know, I have concerns about my child's reading. And so I Googled and I went down a rabbit hole of craziness, right? And can you give parents like your top 2-3 trusted resources for helping them learn more about how do children learn to read?
Yes. I have one with me. I brought it with me for show and tell. I recommend this book. Annie, you probably are very familiar with it. To everyone. It is Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties by David Kilpatrick. I think he does an excellent job explaining what oftentimes, unfortunately, schools throughout our country are getting wrong when it comes to reading, what good reading instruction looks like, what a reading assessment should include, what reading, what different terms related to reading are. And I think it's really empowering for parents to have that information. And I think it's a good starting point to start. I think he lays everything out in a really organized, easily digestible manner. So that would be, this book, I would say, would be my biggest recommendation in terms of a resource for parents.
And Annie, what would you have to add, and especially ones that are free and online?
Great question. So I just want to jump back to what do you do at home? I wanted to add one thing there. I think a lot of it depends on kind of the child's mood and the child's ability to tolerate frustration. I often recommend that parents and families continue to preserve the pleasure of reading and leave the intervention piece to the professional, because a lot of times it really gets in the way of the relationship. And I always recommend preserving the relationship. I can speak to that for all of the students I've ever worked with, and my own child as well, who refuses to practice phonemic awareness with me. And I think, as you're reading aloud, I often find if you feel like you can model the sounding out of the word, if you can just say like, oh, that's cat, say it after me, and keep it really simple and straightforward, and make it a really pleasurable, positive experience, especially if you're at the beginning stages of figuring out that there may be something difficult for the child with reading. In terms of the resources, I have a few that I'll put into the chat, but just as an overview, there's a lot going on in Florida. There's the University of Florida Literacy Institute, has a great collection of parent resources. And then the Florida Center for Reading Research also has resources for parents. And I'll highlight one of those, which is called a CBM at Home. It's a curriculum-based measure that parents can do. So if you feel like, oh, maybe I need more information than what the school is giving me, here's like a valid measure I can do at home. The National Center for Improving Literacy has a few great resources and infographics that you can use that are digestible, that can be shared with a classroom teacher, but also with a principal or someone who may not be kind of immersed in the reading world. And then lastly, just a shout out to the show Reading Buddies, which is a new show from the Reading League about really the beginning stages of reading. It's darling and delightful, and actually an amazing introduction to some beginning reading skills. So I'll put those in the chat.
And the Reading League, I should say too, is a nonprofit that attempts to bridge the gap between reading research and practice, and also has other parent resources. Kathy, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn over to you because I see the chat has been firing up, and I know you've been organizing the questions a bit.
Thank you, Tara. We've got some questions that are specific to dyslexia and screening in particular. So could you address, or your colleagues, how DCPS score dyslexia and when specifically they do it, and if it's recommended pre-K level?
So there are screeners 3 times a year. Students in K-2 will take the DIBELS measures. That's universal across the DC public schools. I can't speak to what the charters do, but I do believe some of them also use that as well. And so that is not necessarily a dyslexia specific screener. It's not testing things like rapid automatized naming, phonological memory. So it's not a full dyslexia evaluation by any means, but it could flag that there are difficulties that warrant more investigation. And I think I forgot the second part of the question.
At what age or grade is the screening being done? And should it be happening in pre-K?
So it is happening kindergarten, first and second. I would love to see something at the end of pre-K 4. A number of researchers, including Nadine Gabb, have suggested we really do need something at the end of pre-K 4, so that we're not kind of waiting through the beginning of kindergarten. We know that these assessments really take a lot of time, and for some schools, all of September is taken up with assessments. So if we can figure out what's going on at the end of pre-K 4, we can start immediately in kindergarten, and really get some of those earlier skills solidified before the student gets further behind. So yes, definitely recommend at the end of pre-K 4.
And Annie, can you just build on that by saying how a child who is in a bilingual environment, how that might be factored into screening?
That's a good question. I'm going to preface that with that I'm not going to answer this perfectly, but I do think it's important to do the assessments in both languages for children who are bilingual, because we need to know what is going on with language for them, and then also what is going with their native language and what is going on with the one or more additional languages. So we need that perspective to be able to figure that out as well.
Okay.
I should just, before we jump to the next question, I feel like I've seen hintings in the chat and been asked to look, how does a child get diagnosed with dyslexia? Who can make that diagnosis? And I should also add, we'll be having a follow-up program on Wednesday, November 10th, specifically about your child received a diagnosis of dyslexia, now what? But I hope it doesn't hijack the questions, but I feel like that's something that keeps coming. Who can make that diagnosis? This is for either of you.
I'm kind of shirking a little bit, because this is a situation where what I think would be ideal is not necessarily what is the norm right now. In theory, a school could diagnose a student with dyslexia. There is nothing preventing them from doing that. In practice, what we often see is that the dyslexia diagnoses are coming from outside psychologists and not from the school system. Through the school system route, you may get a diagnosis of reading disorder, which, you know, essentially for the child, it's the same thing. But if we know it's dyslexia, then we know what to do to support the child.
And Amanda, can a parent come to a speech pathologist to get an evaluation for dyslexia?
Yes, absolutely. If you have a speech language pathologist who specializes in literacy, then they would also be an appropriate person to evaluate the child for dyslexia. You know, I sometimes get asked the question, when do I know to go for a psychoed or neuropsych from a psychologist, or whether I should come to a speech language pathologist for a literacy evaluation? And what I say to parents is, it depends what your concerns are. If you have concerns in addition to your child's literacy skills that include potential attention weaknesses, behavioral concerns, gross and fine motor skill concerns, anxiety, depression, anything like that, then I would say it's better to go to a psychologist for a more holistic look at the child's learning profile and things related to that. A good time to come to an SLP would be that if you don't have those other concerns, you think your child is attending well in class or throughout their day overall, you don't have any major behavioral concerns, no major motor concerns, and really they're struggling with the reading, writing, and or other oral language, or maybe production of speech sounds, then I would recommend going to a speech language pathologist who specializes in literacy, who can look at the entire language profile, or specifically at written language, reading and writing.
Kathy, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack your.
No, not at all. Not at all. That's fine. There was a question, Amanda. If a child's receiving an IEP for speech problems, but is also struggling with phonics or phonemic awareness, also be receiving a separate intervention for those things, or do improvements in speech naturally correct other problems?
So oftentimes, I will see it's not uncommon because they come from the same phonological deficit base that a child who has a speech sound disorder will also have difficulties in phonemic awareness and phonics. Correcting the speech sound disorder will, it depends. So let's say your child produces the F sound for TH. So they say like with instead of with, and they write the word with as WIF. That is directly related to their speech. So I would say that if you're seeing really isolated errors like that, then there is a good chance that just working on the speech will then translate into, correcting some of those phonologically based spelling errors. However, usually there's something more going on. And I would say if your child has difficulty producing speech sounds, but you're also seeing some pretty clear weaknesses in phonemic awareness and phonics, I would want to see those skills separately evaluated and then treated.
Thank you. Lindsay has put several good questions in the chat, not surprisingly. And she asked, can you get the same level of support in school, like an IEP or a 504 with a diagnostic evaluation from an SLP?
So if you take an outside evaluation from any practitioner doing the evaluation, whether that's an outside psychologist or a speech language pathologist, and they've given the assessments necessary to make a diagnosis. So if they're looking at everything a good dyslexia evaluation should look at, RAN, phonological memory, untimed and timed phonic decoding, word level reading, contextual reading, they have enough information to make a diagnosis. You should be able to present that hard data to the school and receive support and services for that.
Another question, I think this one was from Lindsay also. Do students with dyslexia struggle with those small function words that you were talking about, not really paying attention to those in reading, but the question scrolled off my screen, sorry. But she wants to know if that's an indication of orthographic weakness, if they struggle with those small function words.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So essentially, I would say every child I see, no matter how, where they fall on the spectrum in terms of severity with their dyslexia, does substitute, omit, add in those small high frequency words. Oftentimes my students also have a diagnosis of ADHD, which can contribute to those types of errors. But it's, I think, also directly related to, perhaps not having strong mental representations of those different words. It could be, that they are so focused on trying to decode the other bigger words in the text that then they make those types of mistakes with the smaller words that they're not as focused on. It's really common to see that in students with dyslexia, and there are ways you can explicitly work on kind of reducing those errors within intervention.
Okay. And then our most recent question is, do you have suggestions regarding on a school when the school determines your child is not doing poorly enough in reading or writing to merit dyslexia testing? This person's experience is that DCPS thought her child was below grade level reading, but it was good enough in second grade, and now they're in elementary and awaiting a neuropsych evaluation for dyslexia.
Yeah, this is a really hard question, and I've seen this too many times, where we have students who have figured out how to compensate by guessing at words, in some cases even being taught to guess at words, or getting used to predictable text. And so that can really mask the difficulty, and sometimes up until second, third, fourth grade, we can have students who really just memorize a lot of words and then guess at a lot of words. And so, that doesn't mean that this absolutely should not have happened. A lot of times that's kind of why the problem doesn't become severe enough. Some researchers refer to this as kind of like the dyslexia paradox, right? Like it has to be severe enough for someone to notice that something is wrong. And that's kind of the heartbreaking part of it. And so, my recommendation is to ask the school to look at some of those sub-skills. A lot of times if you give a child an oral reading fluency test and they're reading kind of connected text, like a regular paragraph, a lot of times they've learned enough irregular words and they can figure out kind of what word comes next based on the context that it doesn't look like it's so severe. But if you ask them to read nonsense words, it turns out they actually don't know how to decode at all. And that's really, some of your best proof that something significant is occurring. And so I think we have to keep kind of advocating for ourselves and our children in that way, because reading just a little bit behind when you could be far ahead is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to just be kind of near average if you could be far above average. I'm hopeful that the dyslexia bill, though it's not funded, I'm hopeful that will kind of bring about change in this area, as well as thinking about a lot of the work the district is doing to think about how to bring in reading science into instruction and professional development.
The dyslexia bill is funded, so it was fully funded. It got fully funded in July.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. quick
Fantastic news.
No problem.
Could someone talk about the difference between sight word reading versus word recognition?
So sight word is really a tricky term. A lot of times we see that on materials that come home from school. I have seen that this week myself. But really what we're thinking about is, is the word irregular? Can we not sound it out in the way that we sound out other words? And so there's that distinction. And then there's also the distinction of, is it a word that the child is sounding out in that moment? Or is it a word that they've sounded out enough times that they've moved it to permanent memory so that they recall it immediately? So they're really kind of two different things going on there. And sometimes they get conflated. But we really want to think about, can they read irregular words? And how are they doing with decoding words and then moving them to permanent long-term memory? And we want to watch out for both of those things because difficulty with both of those can also be a sign for dyslexia.
Yeah, Annie just, I guess, spoke to this, but I want to make sure people understand that people use the term sight words to mean different things. So oftentimes what you're seeing sent home from classroom teachers to practice sight words, they can come from a list called the Dolch word list, DOLCH, or the Fry high frequency word list. They're essentially, some people mean high frequency words when they see sight words. Some of those can be phonetically decoded and some aren't. Some mean, irregularly spelled words. But in reading science, when we're thinking about, what sight word means, it means it's committed to the word is embedded in your brain for effortless retrieval. You recognize the word on sight. And the way we get to that is through improving and strengthening those other skills, phonemic awareness and code knowledge, that lead to good phonic decoding. And the more you're exposed to text and the more you phonically decode unfamiliar words, that's how you start to gain and build this sight word, these instantly recognized words.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions that have to do with the pandemic and virtual instruction, not surprisingly. Saying, this is all great guidance during normal times, but how does it apply now? And how do you know the difference between a learning disability and inadequate instruction? And frankly, does it?
It's really hard to know right now at the beginning of the school year. We're 4 weeks in. And so it is really hard to know. Is it because instruction was uneven, or is it because there really is a reading difficulty? One thing to look out for is the rate of growth. So how quickly, now that, if your child was virtual and now is back in person, how quickly are they learning now? And that will give you a good sense of, okay, maybe it was, if they're learning quickly, picking things up, maybe it was the virtual environment and the world that was part of the difficulty. If it's still really difficult and it's still a struggle, then that's a sign that there may be more going on. And I think in some ways it's not important, and in some ways it is. Either way, if the child is struggling, they deserve some support. It doesn't matter what the cause is, they deserve the support. And I just want to advocate that support can be done during the school day, so that kids don't have to worry about kind of the self-esteem hit from doing some of this after school, or missing out on other activities. This is really work that can be done during the day. The other thing is, in terms of what we would do for an intervention might actually be different based on whether it was because of virtual instruction or because of a reading disability. If it's dyslexia, I'm going to provide a lot more repetition than I might otherwise, and I might do some additional work kind of investigating what's going on with phonemic awareness, whereas if it was just a result of virtual instruction, I might not necessarily do those things or do them quite as explicitly or with as much repetition.
I think it's important too to keep in mind that although reading isn't an innate skill to human beings, most typical readers will pick up reading and become proficient readers with little explicit instruction. Then there's a subset of students who wouldn't necessarily be classified as having dyslexia, but they need, they're at risk of becoming struggling readers, and they need more explicit support in the beginning. And once they get that, they can launch. Then you have another group of children who really struggle with reading, even though they've been given substantial instruction. So I think I would also ask myself, is this something where I'm noticing now that, kind of what Annie said, now that my child is back in school and receiving some instruction, are they starting to launch and make some rapid progress? Or does it seem like even though this explicit in-person instruction is happening, they're still kind of chugging along and moving slowly with their progress?
I know we have to wrap up, but I also just wanted to add understood.org is a great, reliable resource for parents who are looking for advocacy tips and understanding a lot of the terminology around dyslexia, IEPs, 504s, and is a trusted resource. And also every state or district has a parent training and information center. And so in DC's case, it's Advocates for Justice and Education. And so they can also provide education and resources around accessing special education for public students. And again, I know Kathy dropped it in the chat, but our DC chapter of the International Dyslexia Association, Decoding Dyslexia, are having another program on Wednesday, November 11th, helping parents navigate 10th, corrected, on Wednesday the 10th from 7 to 8, same time, helping parents navigate a dyslexia diagnosis and figuring out their next steps. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend going to the International Dyslexia Association website. Has a lot of great resources about dyslexia, and connecting with your local Decoding Dyslexia chapter. And DC has a really vibrant, robust one, which was really, the brains behind making that bill pass. So I'm sorry, I hope we covered everyone's questions. I'm so grateful to Annie and Amanda for shedding so much light on early reading and spelling and what it looks like and what needs to happen and how parents can ask the right questions and advocate for their children. And thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope you'll join us for our next program and look into being members of either our groups and use